Hello, in this tutorial we're going to be working with collision or collision detection. Basically collision is knowing when the border of an object or the outside of an object has come into contact with another object. So when two objects come into contact with each other. So for objects to use Unity's built-in physics engine, they need to include a component, and that component is called the rigid body component. So we'll be working with the rigid body component in this tutorial, and to add the rigid body component to an object, you can simply just click on the object, either in the hierarchy or in the scene, and then you can click on add component, and you'll find it under physics, and then rigid body. So you can add it from there, which we'll do shortly. So that's the rigid body component, and basically that gives you several different properties to work with, including mass, drag, which is the amount of air resistance, applied to an object when it's moving. So an object with higher drag will need more force to move, and it'll also stop at a faster rate. You can also add angular drag, so that's air resistance that's applied when turning. There's other properties like use gravity, collision detection, and so on. So we'll be adding some collision detection later, and in order for objects to detect collision, they need to use a component called a collider. So lots of your objects might have two components. They might have a rigid body and a collider as well. And so a collider is just a perimeter around an object that can detect when other objects have entered it. So objects don't need rigid bodies to collide. All they need is a collider object. But rigid bodies allow objects to fall, and they're also needed for things like trigger collision, which we'll talk about later. Okay, so objects like cubes, spheres, and capsules, they already have collider components attached to them. So when you create something like this cube that I've got here, you'll see it will probably have a box collider already attached to it in the inspector. And same with this cube here, which is it's actually not really a cube anymore, but it was created from a cube, so it's got a box collider as well. And so, when you go up to game object and create a 3D object like a sphere, well, this sphere also has a sphere collider. Okay, so objects like cubes, spheres, capsules, they already have collider components when they're created, but you can add a collider to an object by selecting the object. So say if this sphere didn't have a collider, well, you can select the object, go over to the inspector, click on add component, and then go to physics, and then you could add either a box collider or a sphere collider or a capsule collider, mesh, wheel, and so on. So even if, say, a cube comes with a cube collider, a box collider already attached, you might want to delete that box collider and change it to a sphere collider. And basically that would make a cube act like a sphere and it would roll around like a ball. So you could do things like that as well. So I'm just going to delete that sphere because I don't need it. But when you create an object like a cube or a sphere or anything else like that, it will come with a collider. So you won't always need to create colliders. Okay. A mesh collider basically just takes the exact shape of a 3D model, but it can reduce the game performance quite a lot. So try and not use mesh colliders. So when a collider is added to an object, the collider will appear in the inspector panel over here for that object. Colliders have a number of different properties you can see there. So they have properties like is trigger, the material, so you can apply physics materials to change the way an object behaves. So an object can behave like a rubber or metal or wood and so on. So you can add different properties there. You can create different physics materials. Okay, you can change the center as well. So the center of the collider and the size. So you can do that. There's also, depending on what shape you've got, you can change geometric properties. So if you've got a sphere with a sphere collider, then you can change properties like radius. Okay. So you can also mix and match colliders. Um, as I mentioned, so you can add a sphere collider to a cube so it will roll around like a ball. You can change the size of a collider so that the object either floats above other surfaces or it might sink into other surfaces. So you can experiment and mix and match with different colliders. Okay, and that's what we're going to do now. So basically, just to give you an idea of what I've got here, I've got a terrain set up. It's just a flat terrain. Okay, so nothing special about this terrain. It's about terrain width and length. It's 500 by 500. And then just above that terrain, I've got my main camera, which happens to be looking at this cube here, and also this cube here, which has been modified into just a rectangular prism. And then over there behind, I've got a directional light there, just looking down. Okay, I might just move my camera back a little bit just so it can see everything there. All right, there we go. All right, so set up. So I've just put this cube above this one here, and I've just changed the angle or the rotation of this one as well. So we can sort of play around with having this cube land and then roll off, okay? Because this one's on an angle or a slope. All right, so that's what we're going to do. What we need to do next is we need to add a rigid body component. So to start with, we need to add the rigid body component to each of these objects. So I'm going to select the first cube, which is this one. I'm going to go over to the inspector and click on Add Component, Physics, and then Rigid Body. All right, and we're going to leave that as is. Okay. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my second shape here, Cube 1, which is this one. I'm going to go over to the inspector, Add Component, Physics, and then Rigid Body as well. But this time I'm going to uncheck where it's where we've got Box Collider. I'm going to, oh sorry, not Box Collider, down here on Rigid Body, I'm going to uncheck Use Gravity. Okay, so it says Use Gravity. I'm just going to uncheck that. Now I'm going to play this scene. Just watch what happens. All right, so basically, just to give you a run through of what's going on there, I've got cube 1, which is this bottom green cube. I've turned gravity off so that it just kind of hangs there in space without moving. Okay, but as soon as this cube hits it, it comes down and hits it, it takes it with it. So the cube's got, this cube here's got gravity on it, the red one, and as soon as it lands on this green panel here, it takes it down with it, and then it just rolls a little bit or bounces a little bit, and then it sits there. Okay, so that's some basic physics in Unity. All right, so the top cube, it falls onto the other cube, and they both kind of land there on the terrain and stop. Okay, so we're going to change things around a little bit and just stop that scene. And we'll go to this bottom green cube here. Okay, and we'll just scroll down here where we've got rigid body on the inspector panel, and we've got constraints there. So if you don't see the constraints, just click on the little arrow next to it, and then you'll see here freeze position, and you'll also see freeze rotation. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to check all these boxes here. So I'm going to freeze rotation and position for all three axes, X, Y, and Z axes. Okay, now I'm going to play that scene again. All right, now see how this time the top cube falls and it hits this green cube here, and instead of taking the green cube down with it and landing on the terrain, it actually, the red cube just lands on the green cube, and now it kind of rolled away a little bit, and now it's actually sliding slowly off the side. So the top cube falls and then it stops on this bottom green cube, and then it just slowly was sliding off it as well. Okay, what I'm going to do now, just to change that up a little bit, is I'm going to go to the top cube, this red one. All right, I'm going to change the collider. So where I've got this box collider, which is the default one that came with it, I'm actually going to remove it. So you can just click on that little settings cog there next to box collider, click on remove component, and then we're going to add a collider again, but this time we're going to add a sphere collider. So we can click on Add Component, we can go Physics, and then we can go Sphere Collider. Okay, so now we have a sphere collider here. All right. So that's how you do that. Now I'm going to run that scene again. All right, and now see how this cube is actually acting like a ball because it's got a sphere collider now instead of a box collider. So instead of acting like a box or a cube would if it fell, it's acting like a ball or a sphere would behave if that fell. So it's just rolling away like a ball. Okay, I'll play that again. All right, so it just rolls away. And it should slow down rolling, but it will roll off away from the scene out of the camera's view. Okay, so it rolls off. Even though it's actually a cube, it behaves like a sphere and rolls away. So you could experiment with those things there and play around with that a little bit, and you can try different colliders as well. So it's a good opportunity at this point now that we covered this, just to pause the video and play around with different colliders there and changing some of the settings and seeing what will happen. This time, what we're going to do for the rest of this video is have a look at physic materials. So that's another thing we can play around with. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go up to Assets, I'm going to go down to Create, and then Physic Material. Now, by creating a new physic material, I can give these two objects, I can basically change the way that they'll behave when they land on the ground. So I could give them properties that are like the properties of rubber or metal or wood and different materials like that. So I'm going to make a new physic material. I just created there from the Assets menu. I'm going to call this one Bouncy. So it's going to act a little bit like rubber. It's going to bounce. So we're going to apply this physic material to this cube up the top here, the red one. So I'm going to click on that. Okay, and in the, where is it? There we go. So under the sphere collider here, we've got the option for material. Okay, so we can actually add a material there. Now at the moment it's got none, but if we click on that little circle next to that, you'll see there's two there. There's one called Zero Friction and there's one called Bouncy, which we just made. So we can double click on that. All right, now if we click on play, it might have a little bit more bounce. Okay, not quite. So there's one thing we might change. If we go to this bouncy physic material here, I haven't actually, I've called it bouncy, I forgot to actually give it bounce. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change bounciness from 0 to 1. Okay, so bounciness can be a value between 0 and 1, whereas 1 is a lot of bounce and 0 is none. So I'm going to give that a bit of bounce, or a lot of bounce. And where it says bounce combine, I'm going to change that to maximum. All right. So that's what I just forgot to do. Now those settings have been saved for that bouncy physic material. So I don't need to go back and change the material there. I can just click on play. It's still using that material with the new properties. And there we go. So now it's starting to bounce away. Now it should have actually probably bounced off that a little bit, but it's probably something I need to change there. So it does land there and then it kind of bounces away once it hits the terrain. Okay, so you could go back, or you could create another physic material and you could play around with the properties there, like dynamic friction, static friction, bounciness, friction combined, bounce combined. There's lots of properties you can play around with there to kind of make a physic material like a metal or a wood or rubber, so it will behave like that. Okay. All right, so now what we're going to do is we're going to look at triggers. All right, so the last thing in this video we'll look at is triggers. All right, so before you go on to triggers, just have a play around with those different physic materials. But triggers can basically call 3 different methods that allow you to program what a collision event will mean. So we've had these two objects colliding with each other. I mean, this cube here has landed on this green panel here. So there's been a collision there, but there hasn't really been any collision events or any collision detection. So we can add triggers which will allow us to program what a collision event will actually mean. So what it will do, what will occur after something's collided. So there's three different methods that we can use, and those are on trigger enter. So that's called when another object enters a trigger. There's on trigger stay, and that's called when another object stays inside the trigger. And then there's on trigger exit, and that's called when another object exits the trigger. So say if we had this green panel here, if we ticked this box is trigger, we could then program this, we could add a script that would basically do something when this cube hits it, so when it enters the trigger, and if it stays in the trigger, we could program it to do something else if it stays inside that panel. And we could also program it to do something when it falls through, so when it leaves this trigger. So if I click on play, because I've clicked on this green panel here, and I've ticked this box under the box collider properties. I've ticked the box next to is trigger. So now if I click play, this cube will actually fall straight through, and because I've added bounciness to it, it's just going to keep bouncing through as well. So this green panel rectangular prism now has the is trigger property turned to on. So what we can do is we can code it so that we can get a message every time this red cube enters this trigger, and when it stays in there, and when it leaves. Now that can be pretty handy. Triggers can be used to program what will happen, say if a player falls off a map. So if a player falls off a map or lands in water, you could respawn them, so send them back to the spawn point. Okay, or if a bullet enters a body or something like that, or an enemy enters a perimeter, or somebody leaves a perimeter, then you can program the game to do different things on those events. Okay, so I'm about to add some code to this. I'm going to attach it to this cube, and basically the code is going to display a message in the console whenever another object enters this cube, the green one, okay? The panel, it's not really a cube anymore. Okay, so I'm going to add some code that will display a message in the console whenever this red cube enters it. So it enters the trigger and leaves, and then enters again and leaves, so it bounces up and down, okay? So you can do something more advanced than that. You can do whatever code you want on a trigger event, but I'm just going to display a message to the console just to test it out. So I'm going to click on cube 1. All right, I'm going to go into my scripts folder in the assets panel, and I'm going to right click and click on create C# script. Okay, so I'm just going to give this a name like trigger script. Can't think of a better name. All right, and I'm going to attach that. I'm going to drag it onto cube 1, the green one, and let go. So now that's attached there. It should be down the bottom here. Here it is. So it's attached to this green panel. Now I'm going to double click on trigger script so I can open it in MonoDevelop, and I can make some changes. Okay, so this is the trigger script here. We're not going to use the start or update methods because we're actually going to create a new method. So we're going to add some code here that will basically display a message in the console whenever another object enters this object, the green panel. So I'm going to say void. Now remember there's 3 different methods we can use. We can use on trigger enter, on trigger stay, and on trigger exit. So I'm going to say for this example on trigger enter, I'm going to use this method, and then in brackets collider other. Okay, so it basically means when another object enters this trigger, then we'll do something. So whatever's inside this method. So I'll just add the curly brackets after that, after I've put that method there. we're just going to basically display a message in the console, simple print message. So print another object has entered the trigger. Okay, and we can close those brackets and end that line with the semicolon. So basically in this code, other is referring to another object, all right? Any other object that interacts with this green panel. Okay, and in this example, it will be the red cube. Okay, now we've got the console here, so we'll just go to the console and we'll play this game. All right, so notice every time this red cube goes through the green panel, the message comes up here in the console saying another object has entered the trigger. All right, so that's pretty simple. Instead of having the print statement though, you could have something like you could change a variable's value. So maybe if this red object was a weapon, like maybe it was a bullet, and this green object was a character, then maybe every time this red object hits this green object, health could be decreased by 1, or the number of lives could be taken off, or the score could reduce. Okay, so there's some examples there. We could also change this code up a little bit, so we could go back to monodevelop, and we could change the print message a little bit here in this example. So we could say something like, we'll just get rid of this here, and we'll put space has. All right, and just before this string here in the quotation marks, we could put other dot game object dot name and then plus. So basically it will show the name of the other object, and it will say after that has entered the trigger. So we can save that and go back to Unity, clear the console, play it again, and so now it's saying cube has entered the trigger. Okay, so that can be handy as well to refer to an object by name. And we could even destroy the object that has entered the trigger. So we could say, we could just modify this code here. So we could say void on trigger enter collider other, and instead of having this print statement here, we could say something like destroy other dot game object. Okay, so it'll actually destroy the red cube. All right, so save that and run it again. There we go. So the red cube is destroyed. It just disappears. Okay. So that's pretty cool. So that's basic collision, collision detection. We've looked at physical materials, and we've just also looked at triggers. So that's pretty much basic collision detection in Unity 3D. Thanks for watching.